to the significance of what we're contemplating taking on as a business and as a country. So hopefully that was a good context-setting session. And I will also say we don't just make steel at New Zealand Steel, we actually make colour steel through the round window there. You might see some happening, and I think, yep, we're still making colour steel according to the screen there. So I think the significance of this decarbonisation project, it also changes the embodied carbon associated with our building materials in New Zealand. So in the future, colour steel will have a lower embodied carbon as a result of that. So without further ado, I might ask the Prime Minister to say a few words.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou, everybody. Can I acknowledge my ministerial colleagues, Megan Woods and James Shaw? Thank you for being here. Can I also acknowledge Robin Davies and Mark Vasella, and thank you for hosting us for this pretty exciting event, I think. When I became the Prime Minister, I said that I would be focused on making sure we were prioritising investments that made the biggest difference, and that involved reprioritising some of the government's work programme. We know that reducing our emissions as a country is one of the most pressing priorities that we have. The present severe weather that we have been experiencing is a clear reminder that we both need to adapt to climate change and continue our ongoing efforts to make sure we're mitigating the effects of climate change as well. And making sure we're bringing down emissions is quite critical. Climate change, when it comes to the question of climate change, the question that I've been asking is, what are the things that we can do that are going to make the biggest difference? When it comes to emissions reductions, what are the things that we are going to be able to do, working alongside industry and others, to make the biggest difference in terms of our emissions? But we've also got other questions to ask. How do we ensure that we go through a just transition? How do we make sure that we're supporting people into new jobs and that we're protecting as many of our existing jobs as we possibly can as we go through that process? Mitigation and adaptation related to climate change does not need to mean deindustrialisation. And that's a really important point. So New Zealand Steel here produces 2.7% of New Zealand's overall emissions. But it also creates 1,000 jobs. It's a vital part of our supply chain that unlocks so much of our other economic potential as well, producing something that we need a lot of. The government, through the Government Investment in Decarbonising Industry, or GIDI investment, is very focused on supporting industries to make that just transition. So I'm very pleased to be here today to announce what is by far and away our largest GIDI investment so far. $140 million of co-funding for the construction of a new electric arc furnace here at New Zealand Steel. The evidence of what this will achieve speaks for itself. 100,000 tonnes of carbon no longer being polluted into the atmosphere every year. To put that into context, that's the equivalent of taking 300,000 cars off the road. That's all of the cars in Christchurch, which we'll be saving in terms of the emissions that will no longer be being produced here. It reduces New Zealand Steel's emissions by around 45%, or around 1% of New Zealand's overall annual emissions. But there are some more as well, because the investments that we're making here, the co-investment that we are making here, also opens up much more possibility for the use of scrap steel. That's a really important part of our circular economy, making sure that we are reusing materials once they're past their first useful life, making sure that we're reusing them again. This will be the largest single emissions reduction project in New Zealand's history. Over 5% of our emissions reductions from emissions budget 2 and 3.4% of our emissions reductions in emissions budget 3. It is a very significant contribution to our efforts as a country to reduce our carbon emissions. I want there to be absolutely no doubt about this government's commitment to reducing our emissions and to tackling climate change. When I said I wanted us as a government to focus on investing in the things that can make the biggest difference, this is the sort of thing that I had in mind. It is incredibly good value for money. Working alongside industry, co-investment from government can make a big difference. It can significantly reduce our emissions. It can ensure that we're creating new jobs and protecting existing jobs, whilst also protecting vital supply chains for our overall economy. So I'm really proud to be part of today's giddy announcement, and I'm now going to hand back to our host, or I think I'm handing over to Megan Woods, who's going to share a few more of the salient details. Thanks.
Well, kia ora koutou, everybody, and thank you, Prime Minister. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues and everybody else in this room that's here today. Speaking after the Prime Minister at something like this is a bit like playing bingo. Before you get up to speak, you cross off all the things he said that were in your speaking notes. So I do want to emphasise a couple of points here, because I want to re-emphasise the point that the Prime Minister made, that this is our biggest opportunity so far that we've had to cut emissions from a single project in New Zealand, and we can't underestimate what a big deal that is. Seeing the scale of the operation on the tour that we've just been on is a good reminder of what a critical part of the New Zealand economy it is. 70% of the domestic steel that is used in New Zealand is made here. And I think one thing that I was really struck by, that this is a site that has always had to innovate in order for us to make steel here in New Zealand. In the 1960s, we had to work out how it was that we made steel from our iron sands. So I think it is fitting that here today we're seeing what I believe is the first electric arc furnace going in for the purposes of decarbonisation. And I think that is an amazing testament that we're seeing that here in New Zealand. And it also does underscore the belief that our government has that decarbonisation does not need to mean deindustrialisation. And when we look at the numbers that can be achieved through this project, it is truly staggering. This is exactly the kind of project that we had in mind with this kind of impact when we envisioned and created the Government Investment in Decarbonising Industry program. That, of course, was funding for this expanded GIDI program that came through only in Budget 2022. And it seems like only yesterday that I was writing the budget bid in late 2021. So in government speak, that is lightning quick speed, that we're here rolling out the possibility of an amazing opportunity, because this upfront investment now helps us avoid those liability costs of not cutting emissions in the future. It is simple common sense to invest in decarbonisation projects here at home rather than having to go offshore to buy expensive overseas carbon offsets, and it's value for money. When we look at the lifetime abatement costs of this project of $16.20 a tonne for carbon, this is a third of the cost of the current carbon prices. And this is about securing high-value jobs and security for that just transition away from fossil fuels that the Prime Minister spoke about. It makes sense for us as a government to partner with progressive industries such as New Zealand Steel and BlueScope to make sure that we're securing those long-term jobs here in New Zealand. I think that I would also really like to congratulate BlueScope and New Zealand Steel from the very outset for making investment in the reskilling of the workforce here a priority. I know the conversations I've had with Robin and Mark that you're excited about the retraining and reskilling opportunities that exist for the workers here at New Zealand Steel, sending them over to existing electric arc furnaces in the States. And it's great to see that we have Ito here today as well, that this is an important moment for the people who work on this site and gain their job security here. One of the things that we do need to make sure, and I've spoken to the Minister of Housing and the Minister of Building Construction, and she's really happy that we are ensuring that we have a resilient supply chain of what we are going to need for significant infrastructure and house building work that has to happen in New Zealand. When we are dependent on 70% domestically produced steel, what the last few years has shown us is that we don't want to be at the whim of global supply chains at the bottom of the world. So having us having to continue that domestic supply is absolutely critical. And this just didn't happen by accident. This project that we're talking about today can deliver because government is willing to partner with industry, because we are willing to talk to those people who are some of our largest emitters and find ways that we can work together for the good of New Zealand to reduce our emissions. There's still a few steps to go before we can call this project underway, but I'd like to thank everybody involved for the tremendous cooperation it has taken to get us here. This is also incredibly good for the New Zealand electricity sector, and I'm sure Mike will talk more about that. Deals like we're talking about today add to the security of supply in electricity in New Zealand. So thank you for thinking about all these component bits that come together. But I'd really like to thank BlueScope, Mark, New Zealand Steel, Robin, ICA and all the officials from MFE who have been involved in making this happen. But Andrew, you're going to really dislike me for saying this. I'd like to especially mention Andrew Casely, the CE of ICA, who I know has put so much into making this deal happen. Thank you for that, Andrew. I'm looking forward to continuing to monitor the progress, and that will send a shiver down Andrew's spine, on the progress of this project, because the results of this will be truly outstanding. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, good afternoon. Look, before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that we are on the outskirts of Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and that there are still a lot of people who are displaced and suffering disruption from the recent storms and cyclones and flooding events there. And in fact, some of those people will be working here at this plant as well. And I would say, I mean, it's obvious that New Zealand has had plenty of floods and fires and droughts and storms over the years, but I think the frequency and the severity is giving us what is a truly lived experience of being on the front lines of climate change. And that is why today's announcement is so significant. There are not a lot of good news days in climate change, and this is one of the best, because today we are signalling an intention to massively decarbonise one of our leading industries and one of our, in fact, our largest employer in the country over the course of the coming years. As the Prime Minister and the Minister of Energy and Resources have both said, this is the single largest decarbonisation project in the history of New Zealand. 800,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions that will not be going into the atmosphere every single year. It is more than all of the other projects that have been invested in combined. So it is a big deal, Mr. Prime Minister. So it's significant in its own right, just on that front. It has other benefits as well. It really does kickstart the steel recycling industry in New Zealand as well. And one of the things that we've been talking about, of course, is that over the course of the coming 30 years, we are going to be taking something like 4.2 million internal combustion engine vehicles off the roads. We're not going to be able to send them somewhere else because that just exports the problem to somewhere else in the world. So they're going to have to go somewhere, and that's high quality steel that could be coming here and being recycled back into construction materials and so on. So in terms of our efforts to start to build a more circular economy in New Zealand, it is as big a deal on that front as it is on the climate change front as well. And if you'll indulge me with a little bit of political advertising, I have to say that this is only happening because of the work that we have done in government over the course of the last 6 years for New Zealand to play our part in the global effort to face the climate crisis. When you think of the work that we did in our first term, passing through the Zero Carbon Act, the changes to the emissions trading scheme, establishing the Climate Change Commission and a set of legally binding emissions budgets for this country, that has created the context and frankly a source of revenue that we've been able to recycle into projects like this, and sent clearly a signal to industry that now is the time for us to work together to decarbonise New Zealand. So in conclusion, it is huge news. It's huge news for the planet. It's huge news for the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It does ensure that we are certainly playing our part in the global response to the climate crisis. New Zealand, as I have said before, has been very slow to get started on that part of our mission, and we have a long way to go yet as a country. But this certainly is a huge step forward in our decarbonisation efforts, and I do really want to thank BlueScope New Zealand Steel for working with us so closely and kind of grinding through all the details to be able to make this happen, because this is, I know it's a huge deal for your company, but it's a huge deal for our country, and we're very, very grateful for that. New Zealanders this year will have a choice about whether or not we stay the course towards reducing our emissions, decarbonising the country and making a climate that's safe for everyone, or whether to go back into reverse. I think my own view of that is that now is not the time to be changing course, because we're just getting started. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
I've also struck lots out of my speech after that as well. Look, again, thank you to the Prime Minister, Minister Woods and Minister Shaw being here today. It does reinforce for us how significant and historic this event is for us today. Whilst there's a lot more work to do, it does sort of, it's a great milestone to celebrate with you. And ultimately, we're here today out of the willingness of the government, the BlueScope Board and Contact Energy to collaborate on this potential solution. The decarbonisation topic can look very large and complicated and difficult to create a pathway through. But I think if people are prepared to trust each other and collaborate, all sorts of things are possible. So, I think we've had great support from the government. I think, again, the leadership and engagement from Minister Woods and Minister Shaw to kind of work with us on this. Contact Energy to kind of show some real leadership in the energy sector to create a firmed renewable energy source. And an organisation like BlueScope New Zealand Steel to be able to step forward with a proactive solution to the problem. So I think it does take multiple parties to kind of compromise and step forward with what's possible, because doing it on your own is very difficult, I would say. Today's come about from a very significant effort from the New Zealand Steel and the BlueScope team, the government agencies, and again, just acknowledge Andrew Casselly's efforts as part of the ECA team has been very significant in terms of testing our business case and evaluating it. And I think that process in itself gives us all some comfort that we're doing the right thing. So again, appreciate Andrew and the team from ECA. Also, the close connections with MB and Ministry for Environment have been developed over the last few months as well. I think we know each other a lot better now than we did 12 months ago, which is great. Our intention is to install an electric arc furnace, powered by firmed renewable energy and consume recycled scrap that would otherwise be exported. The electric arc furnace is a technology we're familiar with within the BlueScope business. We have 2 very large furnaces operating in the US, offer a mature scrap recycling business that's on the track to make 3 million tonnes of steel. So as an organisation, we are confident in the technology and we know how to run those businesses. So I think that's a good starting point. As we said before, the furnace will be available within 3 years, subject to progressing further. And as we said before, it delivers a significant carbon reduction for New Zealand and the equivalent of taking the 300,000 cars off the road, which is quite a compelling statistic in itself. The project requires an investment of approximately $300 million to install the furnace and transition to the new business model. And those of you who've seen the steel facility today will get a sense of the nature of the change ahead of us. So it's not insignificant, but sort of perfectly doable with the team we have here within BlueScope and New Zealand Steel and the expertise we have within the broader BlueScope group. But again, without the $140 million contribution from the government, this project would not happen. And we would very much be back to the drawing board without that catalyst to kind of make this investment and bring the decarbonisation forward. So it's very significant in that decision-making process. We have more work to do in the coming months with respect to consenting requirements, firm up CapEx assumptions, and to get the scrap supply chain kind of firmed up. Those are the critical aspects to kind of close out and progress to the next stage. But fundamentally, New Zealand has the key enablers to make this project a success. We've got a supportive government, recognition of the strategic importance of a steel industry. We've got firmed renewable energy, and we've got scrap supply. So we have all the major building blocks available in New Zealand, which is a great advantage. Sometimes New Zealand can be seen as a small country with suffers from scale, but it actually has the enablers to make this project a success. So I think, just all in all, we're very proud of our 60-year history in terms of turning iron sand into steel, which was very pioneering and innovative back in its day. But we're equally proud today to describe the future of steelmaking in New Zealand. So thank you. Mark Vasala, our Managing Director, CEO, to say a few words.
Thanks, Robin. Good afternoon, everybody. Prime Minister, Ministers, thank you. It's a great privilege to be here today and to represent BlueScope in what is a co-investment that's a landmark partnership and shows the power of robust public-private investments to meet the large-scale global climate actions that are needed. So what we've done here, I think, make no mistake, this is a template for governments and steelmakers around the world to think about decarbonisation. It's a significant step also for BlueScope in our goals and aspirations, and we have 2030 reduction targets and also a net zero carbon by 2050 aspiration. It's not easy in a hard-to-abate industry like steelmaking, but we recognise that what we require here is sustained action by the entire steel value chain. That's customers, governments and the general public. I think really importantly, this is not a pilot, it's not a trial, and it's set to make real and significant emission reductions, as you've heard about. So I'm very proud to be part of this historic event. It's a true example of climate action in action, and it's a key part of our purpose at BlueScope, which is to create and inspire smart solutions in steel to strengthen our communities for the future. So to Robin and your team, I know there's been an enormous amount of effort gone into this. To the government, thank you very much for your support. It's been, I think, a fantastic example of both governments and companies working together to come up with a fantastic solution. So thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki te iwi o Ngāti Tiata, Premier Hipkins, Minister Woods, Minister Shaw, e te whānau nā raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Mike Fujaho, te kawaka haere a te matahiko, kia ora tātou. What a day. What a tremendous day for us as a country, as an industry, and as a now slightly grey-haired individual who grew up in this region. I can only attest to the importance of New Zealand Steel to the community that surrounds it. And for those who have worked and put in so much mahi to bring it here today, to Andrew, to Robin, to Mark, we appreciate the balance sheet of BlueScope tremendously in this. We are tremendously grateful. And also to Andy and the Simply team who work so hard behind the scenes. I do want to acknowledge that. I do want to just point out a couple of things about the PPA that underpins this. Because it is a template for New Zealand, for Aotearoa going forward. Number one, it's not short term. It's not a date, it's a marriage. It is 10 years. God forbid a COVID shutdown, but it is 10 years. The second thing about it is that the parties have gone into it as equals, and there is that little thing called demand flex, and I can see Alison sitting there. That is important to us at Contact Energy from the perspective of it removes carbon emissions by allowing us not to run our peaking generation, which is powered by gas. It also allows Alison to sleep well at night because it does enable security of supply on those cold winter mornings when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. And that, as a nation, is something that we have to get our heads around. I also want to pay the last element of this, which has been so important, is the creativity of the individuals involved in the collaboration. This has not been a bun fight. The commercials have come second to the collaboration and hard thinking that has gone on. Contact Energy is on its own journey. At the moment, we're investing over $1.1 billion to build the equivalent of 5% of New Zealand's current renewable electricity supply. We have over 700 people in the Taupo region doing that hard mahi right now. Our history as a company is when we started out, we were emitting 2 million tonnes a year. We have come down to 700,000 tonnes a year, and we can see a path to not only net zero, but also in the longer term, potentially gross zero. That is not my credit, that is a tribute to the people who have put the hard work in and the creativity of those who are still to come, who are still being educated, who are still going through our universities. And quite frankly, for this country, this is not about shutting down heavy industry. This is about inviting them in, because we have a profound development resource here for renewable energy. And so if we can attract industry here, bring it on. Ngā mihi nui. Thank you.
How do you want us to unpack to the so I'll look for guidance?
Some questions.
Some questions?
Yeah. Right, we'll open up for questions. Go on then, Rod.
Prime Minister, electric arc furnaces are conventional technology, commercially viable around the world. So why does a $300 million project here need a $140 million subsidy from the government?
Because ultimately it's a good way of reducing our emissions as a country. We can pay other people abroad to reduce to reduce their emissions, or we can invest in protecting New Zealand jobs and reducing emissions here in New Zealand. This is an investment that simply stacks up on the economics. But I can get the Minister to comment on that as well.
So one of the critical things about the GIDI Fund is this is actually looking for deployable, already existing technology. This will be up and running in 3 years. What is different about this electric arc furnace, and I'm sure Robin can talk more about this will be the first time that an electric arc furnace has been installed with the intent of reducing emissions. So it is true to say that electric arc furnaces exist in places like the United States, but that is because it was probably the most cost-effective way of making steel. This electric arc furnace is being put in place with the intent of reducing emissions. But Robin, you may want to add to that.
Yeah, essentially the project is going to take over around $300 million to invest. There's no direct financial reason to make that change other than the support from the government and the $160 million that New Zealand Steel and BlueScope will need to put forward to complete the project and realise all those carbon reductions.
Prime Minister, we had a lovely tour before of the steel making part of the operation. We didn't see a lump of coal, but New Zealand imports a lot of coal. What work will be going on in the broader sense? Fonterra imports a lot of coal, uses a lot of that in dairy production. Huntly, the power station there. What work is going on? And James Shaw, you may want to.
I'll invite the other ministers to comment on this as well. But one of the reasons that we established the GIDI Fund was because we think that we can do a better job of decarbonising industry without deindustrialising the country. We recognise that actually at the forefront of our efforts to reduce our emissions, at the forefront of our efforts to tackle climate change at the moment, are people wearing overalls and high vis. This is something that we've got to back as a country. There's jobs in it. There's a good economic future for us in it. We want to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Moving to electrification in a range of different areas opens up a huge number of possibilities to do that. But I'll let the various ministers comment.
Can I just ask on that, will there be more subsidies coming for operators like Fonterra and the Huntly Power Station?
Well, the GIDI program is still underway, so of course there's more to come from it.
Yeah. Just to clarify on that the GIDI Fund is about the government investment in decarbonising industry. So this is working directly with our industrial process heat users. So Fonterra certainly is one of those, and that we have proactively identified who our largest emitters are and are working directly with those emitters with an aim to find projects where we can decrease. But I think it's worth noting the other measures that the government is taking, that if we look at the electricity side of things, which is we're actually in the last quarter or even half year, we've probably had some of the highest rates of renewable electricity produced that New Zealand has ever had. That we've been getting into the 90% on some days. The measure that we put in place through Budget 23 in terms of making LED light bulbs available, for instance, has the potential to turn off one boiler at Huntly. So energy efficiency is critical to what we do through this work. But when it comes to industrial and process heat use, of course, we are a government that is also phasing out the installation of new boilers. It simply won't be able to put in place a new boiler. And the Giddy Fund has already made good headway into moving a number of coal boilers, particularly in the South Island, where there's quite a high prevalence for our industrial and process heat users to use coal. And of course, there's also the state sector stuff, James, which I'm sure you'll want to talk to.
Yeah, I do. You asked about our program of work. So the Giddy Fund is massive, and obviously that's the fund that we're drawing on today as well. We have our state sector decarbonisation fund, and a couple of weeks ago we announced that by 2025 we will have removed all of the coal boilers from all of our remaining hospitals and tertiary institutions, and in fact I think we'll have removed them all from the state sector entirely by 2030. In addition to that, we set up New Zealand Green Investment Finance, which is a government-owned investment bank, which is working on a commercial basis on loans and equity investments, and occasionally sits alongside the Giddy Fund as well. So there is a huge program of work that has been underway for some time.
Are you working directly with Volunteer and the Huntly Power Station?
I can't speak to individual companies, some of which is because of commercial confidentiality, but I do hope that today's announcement will signal to industry that if you haven't spoken to us yet, it's probably time to get into action.
Yeah, but just to clarify that one of the things that I've asked the board of IKE here, and Alan is here today, and Andrew Casely as Chief Executive, is to go hunting for emissions, to talk to our largest emitters, figure out what we can do together. What is it that can be brought forward so it can make a difference for our emissions budgets as we need to meet them, and that is something that the team have been actively working on.
Prime Minister, you've said there's still money to be spent overseas on overseas credits. Why not create more Giddy-style funds that invest in buying tons of carbon here rather than spending it overseas? For example, you could be, rolling out electric bikes or other things which actually reduce emissions here rather than spending overseas.
So I wouldn't rule out us making further investments in Giddy type programs in the future. One of the things that you will note, though, Bernard, is that one of the schemes that we have not continued with was the colloquially known as the Cash for Clunkers scheme, because actually in terms of the investment required relative to the number of tonnes of emissions reduced, it didn't stack up anywhere near as well as something like this does. This stacks up incredibly well in terms of what we get for our money. So, we're still going to be looking to get the best bang for our buck.
Do you still expect, though, to be spending billions overseas on credits to achieve the Paris targets?
I know that the Minister for Climate Change has a particular view on that.
Well, we don't want to be. We have created a rod for our own back. When the government increased our target just before Glasgow, there was a cabinet decision that was made at the same time that the primary source of that has to be domestic. So I think New Zealand climate change policy previously had been let's pay other people to do it so that we don't have to. We've inverted that and we've said that we need to find every tonne domestically, and let's invest in our own domestic transition before we exercise overseas options. Now, the advice that we've had from the Commission is that it's very hard to do all of that in the 7 years that are remaining to us of this decade, which is, remember, it's a 2030 target. And so, we are exploring other options, but they are quite simply that we have to treat them as a sort of fallback option after we've exhausted all of our domestic options first.
Prime Minister,
how long are we going to be relying on Indonesian coal? Like, how far do we see that situation playing out?
I think one of the things that we saw that there was a spike in imported coal use the winter before last, and that was a particular set of circumstances, which was around both low hydro lake levels, which we certainly don't have this year, but also some outages on some of our gas fields. That was an atypical year. As we've outlined, both in terms of our electricity generation, but more importantly, our use of coal in industrial and process heat, and by ourselves as a government as well, in our schools and our hospitals. That is what we have a plan for phasing out. We do not want to be burning coal to make either electricity or industrial and process heat, and it requires a government commitment around projects like we're here announcing today to ensure that can be the case.
Prime Minister, we'll come over the back. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, just on the Climate Change Commission's advice, just on tweaking the ETS settings, if you don't make those tweaks and allow the carbon price to rise, do you risk missing out on revenue in order to make critical transitions like today?
There is a risk of that, yes. However, it's kind of too early to tell the extent to which that's likely to crystallise. So we've had one auction this year so far, and auctions are taken on a calendar basis. There are still 3 more to happen, and it won't be until we get to the end of the calendar year whether we know, what the impact of it is. The budget documents that came out last week were projections based on the first auction of the year. So Treasury can only work with the information it had at the time. So there's a bit of water to go under the bridge yet.
Just quickly, Mr. Shaw, you're not often looking this happy at the start.
Not often looking happy at all, am I? I'm delighted. I'm absolutely stoked. I mean, this, like I said, this is the single largest decarbonisation project in the country's history. And 800,000 tonnes of emissions every single year in phase 1, with the possibility of more in the future. I mean, that is a very, very big deal.
Was the extension of New Zealand Steel's right to emit to 2046, the decision that Minister Parker made recently, in any way connected with
No,
Steel's
it wasn't.
In that case, why did he do that?
Because it's unconnected, and so whilst this negotiation has been going on for some time, if Minister Parker had called it in because of the constraints in the legal framework, it probably would have arrived at exactly the same result. That process is unrelated, but we obviously knew that we were having this conversation.
Scrap steel is a internationally traded commodity, so how does New Zealand Steel feel about its ability to constantly secure a supply? And might the government consider having any constraints on export of scrap steel to make this project viable?
So at the moment there's 500,000 tonnes of scrap steel exported from New Zealand. We need approximately 300,000 tonnes of that scrap steel. As you say, it's an internationally traded commodity. We're confident that we'll be able to buy the right amount of scrap at the international price at the time. So we don't believe there's any constraint in terms of normal commercial market process to achieve that.
Can I just ask, sorry, the UN said this week, talk about depressing news, I'm sorry to take you back, but that we're fast approaching that 1.5 degrees level, which, does that scare you, and does this do enough?
It should scare everyone. And like I have said many times before, Aotearoa has been very slow to get started on decarbonising our domestic economy. Today is a very big announcement. By itself, this doesn't decarbonise our entire economy, but this is the largest company and the largest emitter of emissions in the country, and so this is a massive step forward for us and a good signal to the rest of industry that now's the time to get started if they haven't already.
Could I just before I come back to you, Bernard, when I said at the beginning of my tenure as Prime Minister that I wanted to focus on the things that are going to make the biggest difference, it's because decarbonising our country is one of our most urgent priorities. So naturally, we've got to focus our time, our energy and our resources on the things that are going to make the biggest difference as fast as we possibly can. Today's announcement definitely falls within that category. It's something that's deliverable within a relatively short time frame. It is going to have a significant reduction in terms of carbon that we're emitting into the environment, and it's going to help our overall economic performance as a country because it's going to help to protect Kiwi jobs. It's going to protect a vital supply chain. This deal stacks up on just about every measure that you could measure it against.
Just on the overall climate emissions strategy, which is a fiscally neutral one, where you don't use the Crown's balance sheet to deal with an intergenerational problem, why don't you use the Crown's balance sheet to more aggressively reduce emissions and choose emissions reduction over debt reduction?
Well, one of the things that we can do is make sure that the decisions that we are taking in terms of where government's spending its money across the board, we're actually doing that in a way that contributes to our overall climate change goals. So investments that the government is making in areas such as building and construction, for example, has a high decarbonisation focus to it. Things that we're doing in terms of the broader public sector, the future investments that we're making in there, of course we place a climate change lens over that. There are other things that we're doing, the clean car discount scheme, for example. We're tackling this on a whole range of different fronts.
Prime Minister, you're going to Papua New Guinea later today.
Yes.
Are you going to be discussing climate goals while you're over there?
I'm sure that will come up. I am doing, for broader issues, I am doing a stand-up, I think, at the airport before we take off. So I'm happy to do other topics over there. But I'm sure, given that this is about climate change, I'm sure climate change will certainly be a topic of discussion.
Could I ask a question of New Zealand Steel? The 800,000 tonnes a year reduction in emissions,
Yes.
is that instead of emissions from coal that you're doing at the moment, or is it to deal with coal, deal with steel increase in production in future?
It's directly as a result of reducing coal in the whole supply chain, so it's directly out of the reduction of coal.
And if you had not been able to put in this arc furnace,
Yes.
would New Zealand Steel have been able to be a long-term viable proposition in New Zealand? Because there's been some discussion you might have to shut down.
Our other options would have been to look at the existing iron-making process and look at things like natural gas or hydrogen to decarbonise the iron-making process. Now, the issue with that is it's not technically and commercially viable to do that, so we're still investigating that. The electric arc furnace solution just brings those decarbonisation or reducing carbon emissions much closer. So it's a available technology. We can act quickly and reduce the carbon emissions accordingly.
And how are you going to get rid of the other 55% by 2050?
So look, we'll look to increase our scrap ratio as a proportion, so we'll reduce our coal proportionally, and we'll continue to look at decarbonising our existing iron-making process from iron sand through the use of hydrogen and natural gas and other direct reducing processes as we go forward. So we still have those options available to us as we go forward. This is the first step of a significant reduction in the overall reduction
and
of carbon.
Do you need a car scrappage scheme to get the scrap that you need to run them?
As I said, look, there's 500,000 tonnes of scrap exported currently from New Zealand, so we've got 500,000 tonnes of scrap available today, theoretically, to reduce our sort of carbon footprint. So we can get to a much lower level of carbon from where we are today.
I just got two questions for you, Robin. One, I'll ask them together. One, are you the son of a coal miner? And second, I was going to ask, is there a sense here, you know, when you look at those startling figures?
I'm the grandson of a coal miner.
But when you look at the you know all of the cars in Christchurch, was there a sense here that that's a scary amount to emit, to pollute essentially, and that's like, when you recognise that, was there a growing sense of guilt as well about the impact you're having on the environment? So
I'll answer the coal miner. I'm a son of a farmer, but I've grew up in the sort of South Wales valleys, not far from where coal mining is, so I'll get that one out of the way. But I've got a strong affinity for coal mining from my historic, predecessors. In terms of, look, I think we'd acknowledge as an organisation we need to act and do our bit in terms of decarbonisation. We've got clear blue scope global targets, and as part of a good corporate citizen in New Zealand, we know we needed a solid plan in order to decarbonise for our future and the benefit of the climate. So there's certainly a sense of pressure and obligation on us and many other organisations to act quickly, and that's what we're trying to do with this project.
And lastly, for contact energy for me, I'm a very slow student, so can you please sort of explain why it's so important, the cooperation bit here in terms of our national group?
Oh, look, traditionally industries like this, they work on high asset utilisation, and so they look to run 100% of the time. What's important for us is for those cold winter mornings when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, so no solar and wind, is our only alternative as a nation then, at the moment, is to start up thermal generation, so what we call our peaking plant. What this enables us to do, what this agreement enables, is that during the winter, during those peak periods, the plant will turn down, so its demand will turn down. So rather than having a peak, you flatten that peak. And that's something that we've been passionate about. It's why we give 3 hours of free power after 9 o'clock at night, because we don't want people using the power between 6 and 9 at night, because that's the highest period of carbon emissions. Does that help?
So you just because I'm slow, you produce outside of those hours, like your.
We've got a base load. We've got base load geothermal. Geothermal is beautiful base load. It's as good as nuclear energy, but far more acceptable. We've got hydro. Outside that period, we can cover the base load, absolutely. Okay.
We mentioned that the social licence to operate, obviously, but what else is in it for NZ Steel to make this transition?
Look, aside from the social licence to operate, I think it's the retention of a strategic asset in the country and being part of that building and construction supply chain. It's the 1,200 employees that work at Glenbrook. It's the 1,500 employees associated with the steel supply chain. So ultimately, it's the right thing to do, and I think it's the right thing for the country to do, and it preserves the employment in its region, which is very important.
And do you know if there'll be any impact on those jobs as a result of this transition?
Look, there'll be a transition from the way we make steel today to the way we make steel in the future, but essentially where people would have been handling coal, they'll be handling scrap in the future. We've still got a steel making furnace to operate, and essentially people will just transition from over a period of time to kind of different roles.
So will you actually be shutting the furnace or just using it less?
No, we will actually be shutting our basic oxygen furnace, and the electric arc furnace will be within a matter of 20 or 30 metres from that sort of basic oxygen furnace. So that furnace will close, and we'll start the electric arc furnace not too far in the building that you saw today.
How much more efficient is that compared to the basic oxygen furnace, the arc furnace?
Look, the key driver for the electric arc furnace is really the change from coal, coal as an iron sand as a source, to scrap and electricity. So really, it's largely making steel in a broadly the same. You get the same outcome in the end, but ultimately, because of New Zealand's decarbonised grid, you get a massive carbon reduction from the coal versus electricity and scrap. So that's the big sort of technology, and therefore the big win for New Zealand Steel and the New Zealand overall.
So that's a point that might have been missed, which is that in other countries where electric arc furnaces are operating, they're often operating using electricity that is itself created by coal. And so one of the big differences here is that electricity source itself is renewable. And so the emissions profile of electric arc furnace steel here versus electric arc furnace steel anywhere else is that.
Minister Shaw, with your Green Party hat on, putting the Green Party hat on, do you think that we can achieve emissions reduction fast enough with a fiscally neutral approach to this?
Well, Bernard, I'm not the Minister of Finance, and I've said before, governments have choices that they can make. The important thing is that we get started, and like I keep saying, we've taken a long time to get started, and today's announcement is a massive step in our journey.
All right, we might wrap up shortly. Because
I'm making steel from iron sands. It's a more coal-intensive process than other methods of producing steel. Sorry, I just.
Currently it is, and hence we're changing to the electrification kind of process. So we've got the traditional process is relatively high in carbon intensity, but we'll look to reduce that over time. But this is the big first step for us to kind of get the.
Just one more. Does this, sorry for either the PM or Minister Shaw, does today's partnership show what opportunity there is in the future of reducing emissions? It's often a conversation that's quite limited.
I think it absolutely does show that government and industry can work together to reduce our emissions, and that's going to be a win-win for the whole country. It's going to ultimately be better for industry. It's going to help to protect Kiwi jobs. It's going to help us reduce our emissions. And I would far rather be doing things like this than paying for other countries to be reducing their emissions. All right, thanks everybody.